Of all detestable places, Washington is the first. Crowd, heat, bad quarters, bad fare, bad smells, mosquitoes, and a plague of flies transcending everything within my experience. Beelzebub surely reigns here, and Willard's Hotel is his temple. George Templeton Strong.
Throughout Lincoln's presidency, and this is true of most presidents, he was fairly run crazy by office seekers, especially at the start when his campaign managers had promised jobs to a great many people who came to collect them. And one man saw him one day, and he looked particularly worried, and the man said, "What's the matter, Mr. President?" And Lincoln said, "There's too many pigs for the tits."
Abraham Lincoln's problems were not confined to fighting rebels alone. The president's unwieldy cabinet included former conservative Whigs, Free Soil Whigs, and Union Democrats. 4 had been his rivals for the Republican presidential nomination. Nearly all were privately sure they could do a better job than their chief. Secretary of State William H. Seward hoped to replace Lincoln. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase wanted to replace Seward. Mary Todd told her husband to get rid of both of them. Instead, Lincoln fired War Secretary Simon P. Cameron, a Pennsylvania boss so corrupt, said Lincoln, that the only thing he wouldn't steal was a red-hot stove. The new Secretary of War was Edwin M. Stanton, an able, ruthless war Democrat from Ohio, who worried about what he believed to be Lincoln's painful imbecility. On one thing, the cabinet was agreed. General George McClellan was not moving fast enough against the Confederates. The Army Secretary of War Stanton said, has got to fight or run away. The champagne and oysters on the Potomac must be stopped.
Dear Ellen, I can't tell you how disgusted I am becoming with these wretched politicians. They are a most despicable set of men. Seward is a meddling, officious, incompetent little puppy. The president is nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. George McClellan.
The president pored over military books, asked officers for advice, and in exasperation suggested that if General McClellan does not want to use the Army, I would like to borrow it for a time. Finally, he ordered McClellan to move on Manassas Junction and then proceed overland to take Richmond. But McClellan would not move and took to his bed with a fever. McClellan did not want to fight the vast Confederate army he had convinced himself now occupied northern Virginia. Instead, he proposed to float his army to Fortress Monroe, at the tip of the finger of land between the James and York rivers. Then race up the peninsula to seize the Confederate capital.
There has been a great battle indeed in the Southwest, a conflict of 2 days, closely fought and with varying fortune and by great armies. It seems entitled to a place among the first-class battles of history. George Templeton Strong.
It was fought in early April. The trees were leafed out, and the roads were meandering cow paths. Nobody knew north from south, east from west. They'd never been in combat before, most of them, especially on the southern side. So it was just a disorganized, murderous fistfight. 100,000 men slamming away at each other.
In early April, as McClellan continued to sit in front of Yorktown, 42,000 Union troops under General Ulysses S. Grant were encamped on the west side of the Tennessee River near Pittsburgh Landing. Grant's invasion of Tennessee had practically cut the state in two, and now he was waiting for Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio to join him. Their combined forces were then to plunge into the heart of Mississippi. But Buell was late, and at Corinth, Mississippi, 22 miles away, the commander of the Western Department of the Confederate Army Albert Sidney Johnston saw no reason to wait. Their armies were still evenly matched, and he would attack and end Grant's invasion. "Tonight we will water our horses in the Tennessee," Johnston told his staff officers on the morning of April 6. The Confederates quietly moved toward the Union lines.
It was a most beautiful morning. It really seemed like Sunday in the country at home. The boys were scattered around camp, polishing and brightening their muskets and brushing up and cleaning their shoes, jackets, and trousers for inspection. Private Leander Stillwell.
At the head of one Union division was William Tecumseh Sherman, who had shaken off the melancholy that had sent him home the previous year. His Ohioans were encamped on a hill not far from a little log-built Methodist church called Shiloh when the 6th Mississippi attacked.
I saw men in gray and brown clothes running through the camp. And I saw something else, too, something I'd never seen before. A gaudy sort of thing with red bars, a rebel flag.
We were crowding them. One more charge and their lines waver and break. They retreat in wild confusion. We were jubilant, and the officers could not curb the men to keep them in line. Sam Watkins.
The battle extended along a 3-mile front. The worst fighting was in the center, where the rebels came on and on like maddened demons, a Union soldier said.
The generals didn't know their jobs, the soldiers didn't know their jobs. It was just pure determination to stand and fight and not retreat. And the bloodiness of it was just astounding to everyone. It also corrected a Southern misconception, which had said one good Southern soldier is worth 10 Yankee hirelings. He found out that wasn't true by a long shot.
In a peach orchard, the Federals lay flat beneath the blossoming trees, firing as the rebels came. Soft pink petals raining down on the living and the dead. By late morning, thousands of untried Federal troops had seen enough. Most did not stop running until they reached the river, where almost 5,000 men cowered beneath the bluff. "We are sweeping the field," General Johnston told his second-in-command, Beauregard, "and I think we shall press them to the river." Grant's back was to the Tennessee. There was no sign of Buell and nowhere else to go. But a thin Federal line held in the center, Illinois and Iowa farm boys mostly, prone along a sunken road. Their commander, Benjamin Prentiss, understood the deadly seriousness of Grant's order to maintain that position at all costs. The Confederates launched a dozen massive assaults against what became known as the Hornet's Nest. Albert Sidney Johnston himself led the last charge.
He came out of it with bits of his clothing nicked all up. One boot sole was shot in half, and he flapped his on horseback there and said, "They didn't trip me up that time." And very soon after that, they saw him reel in the saddle and realized he was hurt. And someone said, "General, are you wounded?" And he said, "Yes, and I fear seriously." And he was shot behind the knee in the femoral artery, I suppose, and bled to death. They saw blood coming out of his boot. And he could have been easily saved with a tourniquet, but he had sent his surgeon off to take care of some Federal prisoners.
Advancing a little further, we saw General Albert Sidney Johnston surrounded by his staff. We saw some little commotion among those who surrounded him, but we did not know at the time that he was dead. The fact was kept from the troops. Sam Watkins.
The command of the Western Army now passed to General Beauregard.
Albert Sidney Johnston was looked on by many people at the time of Shiloh, and especially before Shiloh, while he was holding that line up in Kentucky, as the South's #1 field soldier. Jefferson Davis viewed him as that, and when he lost Albert Sidney Johnston, he said, "I realized our strongest pillar had been broken."
Meanwhile, the center of the Union line bent back on itself, but would not break. The Confederates trained 62 cannon at point-blank range and opened fire. The Hornet's Nest exploded in a hail of splintered trees and shattered men. At 5:30, Prentiss and the 2,200 survivors of his division surrendered. They had held up the Southern advance for nearly 6 hours, and it was growing dark. Beauregard wired Jefferson Davis that he had won a complete victory. "I had General Grant just where I wanted him," he said, "and could finish him up in the morning." Everywhere, wounded men lay in agony. Neither army had yet devised a system for gathering or caring for them on the field. Scores of wounded collapsed and died drinking from a mud hole near the peach orchard, staining the water red. It began to rain, and flashes of lightning showed hogs feeding on the ungathered dead.
Some cried for water, others for someone to come and help them. I can hear those poor fellows crying for water. God heard them, for the heavens opened and the rain came.
Grant spent that night beneath a tree, rather than listen to the screams of the wounded men in his headquarters. It was there that Sherman found him. "Well, Grant," he said, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," said Grant. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though."
Never to me was the sight of reinforcing legions so welcome as on that Sunday evening, when Buell's advance column deployed on the bluffs of Pittsburgh Landing.
During the night, Buell's army finally arrived. The Union men marched ashore as a band played Dixie. At dawn, the Union force, now 70,000 strong, drove into Beauregard's 30,000. The Confederates fell back, counterattacked, fell back again, and began to withdraw. The Union held the field. Covering the Confederate retreat was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who now turned to lead one last cavalry charge, headlong into the pursuing Northern Army.
And he landed square in the main body of the Union troops. He was surrounded by one gray uniform in a sea of blue. And they began to holler, "Kill him, kill the goddamn rebel, knock him off his horse." And one soldier did stick his rifle out into Forrest's side and pulled the trigger and lifted Forrest clear of the saddle with the impact of the bullet. And Forrest, meantime, was slashing with his saber. His horse was kicking and turning. And Forrest sawed him around and got him clear and took off. And they were shooting after him, so he reached down and grabbed one Union soldier and swung him up behind him on the crupper of the horse to use as a shield. And when he got out of range, he threw the man off and rode back to join his command. That was the last shot fired in the Battle of Shiloh.
The ground, Grant said, was so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground.
When the grave was ready, we placed the bodies therein 2 deep. All the monument reared to those brave men was a board upon which I cut with my pocket knife the words 125 rebels.
"2,477 men were killed at Shiloh. There were 23,000 casualties overall, more than all the American casualties in all previous American wars combined. And it was only the beginning."
Shiloh had the same number of casualties as Waterloo. And yet when it was fought, there were another 20 Waterloos to follow. And Grant, shortly before Shiloh, said, "I consider this war practically over. They're ready to give up." And the day after Shiloh, he said, "I saw that it was going to have to be a war of conquest if we were to win." Shiloh did that. And it sobered the nation up something awful into the realization that they had a very bloody affair on their hands. And it called for a huge reassessment of what this thing was going to be.
Years afterward, a Union veteran said the most a soldier could say of any fight was, "I was worse scared than I was at Shiloh." Shiloh is a Hebrew word meaning place of peace.
April 11th, 1862. I firmly believe that before many centuries more, science will be the master of man. The engines he will have invented will be beyond his strength to control. Someday science shall have the existence of mankind in its power, and the human race commit suicide by blowing up the world. Henry Adams.